define vulnerability as three things: the sensitivity to a particular risk or hazard, in this case climate change, the exposure, so how big is the hazard in a particular location, and the adaptive capacity, how able is whatever we're interested in to adapt to that hazard. For ecosystems, the vulnerability is quite complicated because it's determined by the sensitivity of different ecosystem processes within the ecosystem to different elements of climate. So, for instance, we can think of one part of an ecosystem, maybe an insect whose breeding cycle is dependent on the availability of water. So if the rainfall patterns of rainfall in that ecosystem change, then that particular insect might be sensitive to that particular climate change. Another species, maybe a particular tree, which has a very important fruit for the food web, it might be driven by temperature. So when temperatures get to a certain level, it triggers the flowering and the fruiting process. And that might be changing in a different way. So from an ecosystem point of view, there are these individual vulnerabilities that are determined by the ways that individual species interact with climate. And then those integrate up to manifest as an overall change in the structure and function and composition of the ecosystem. That's a little bit different to some of the other concepts of vulnerabilities that we've discussed so far, and it reflects the complex nature of ecosystems. So if we're thinking about that, then how might an ecosystem maintain its characteristics in the face of these changes in climate? And there are two main ways that individual species, and therefore ecosystems as a whole, can respond to changes in climate. The first is by tolerating those changes, and the second is by adapting to them. By tolerating, we mean that the species can cope with the changes in climate that they've experienced. It doesn't take them outside of their sort of comfort zone, if you like, and they're able to persist despite those climatic changes. This is often possible within the cores of ecosystems. So if we think of the tropical forest biome, those evergreen trees, right in the center of Central Africa, the climatic conditions are very, very, very good for persistence of these ecosystems. They're not at the limits of their climatic tolerance. So a small change in temperature or rainfall, or even maybe quite a big one, doesn't take those the climatic conditions to the edge of the tolerance of those species. At the margins of ecosystems, so for instance at the transition zone between evergreen and deciduous forests, a small change can really take species outside of their tolerance limits. And that's where you might start to get these shifts in the presence of different species. So if you had a drying at the border of the evergreen and deciduous forest zone, then you'd start to see these deciduous trees which can cope with longer, drier periods, replacing the evergreen trees. The other way to cope, or that individual species cope with climate change, is through adaptation. And this, very crudely, can happen through two main processes. The first is by mobility and migration, and the second is by evolution. And this evolution can happen through two ways. One is just through within species plasticity. So species do have a variability in their tolerances that allows them to cope with changing physiological conditions. An example of that would be the temperate forest zone, actually, in North America. So if we look at oak trees at the northern and southern ranges of those forests, in the north, the oak trees are much more tolerant to cold because it's colder up there. And in the south, they're less tolerant to cold, but more tolerant to drought. And so even within one species, there's a range of tolerances that they can change quite reasonably rapidly because of this plasticity within their genetic variety within a particular species. If you go outside of the tolerances provided by that plasticity, then one has to talk about evolution as an adaptation. And we've seen this over over millennia and billions of years, species do evolve through natural selection as the environmental conditions change. The main problem with this, both plasticity and evolution, is that the rates of change in climate we're experiencing today are considered by most ecologists to be too fast to allow evolution to be an adaptation. The rates at which the changes that are required, the genetic changes that are required, would need to happen are just too fast for the rates at which evolution by natural selection actually happens. So the alternative adaptation is therefore migration, shifting the ranges within which, the geographical ranges within which species occur as the climatic conditions shift around them. So temperature warming might make the area where a particular species can occur shift geographically, and then the species has to move with that climate shift to be able to persist and colonize a new area. So that's in theory quite easy, but again, in some cases with some species, the rates of change of climate that we're seeing may outstrip their ability to migrate, what we call dispersal rates. That's especially the case for plants and to some extent soil organisms. Plants disperse through generational processes. A plant can't stand up and walk as the climate changes. It has to produce its seeds, and the next generation have to colonize the new climatic area that's suitable for their presence. Soil organisms also move very, very slowly, and also might be limited by the very rapid rates of climate change that we're experiencing. So within an ecosystem, we see impacts that will start with individual species, and then we have to think about whether that species is going to be able to persist in a particular location. But because these ecosystems are these collection of interacting species, there are feedbacks and cascades in the impact between individual responses and other parts of the system. And so what we might start seeing is changes in the structure and function and composition of ecosystems as different parts of the ecosystem respond in different ways, and then those responses impact on other parts of the system. So, for instance, you may see insects migrating faster than the trees that they fertilize and then or pollinate, and therefore that affects then the fertility of the trees that are sort of left behind, if you like, as they can't walk with the insects. One comforting thought, perhaps, is that the direction of shift is likely to be the same within any ecosystem. That's because they've generally evolved or co-evolved together to tolerate a particular set of climatic conditions. So if the climate's shifting in a particular direction, then most of the elements of that ecosystem would shift in the same direction, but perhaps at different rates.